Hello and welcome back to The Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 127 called The Rise and Fall of the Umayyads. First, let me wish you a happy new year and I hope you had a good break if you took time off. I'm pleased to say we're now ready to power into the new year with the rest of the story of the Dark Ages that followed the fall of the Roman Empire. But did I hear you say you're wondering about the future of this podcast? After all, it is called The Fall of the Roman Empire, and we're now hundreds of years after it fell. So, how much longer have we got? Well, the bad news is that yes, unfortunately, we're getting close to the last episode, since I don't want to take this podcast beyond the year AD 1000. I know the celebrated historian Edward Gibbon took his decline and fall of the Roman Empire to 1453, when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. But I don't want to do that because I prefer to look at a larger subject than just the Byzantine Empire. So the good news is that I'm planning to launch a new podcast this year on another major event in world history. What is it? Well, I haven't completely decided, but I think it will probably be on the Crusades. Does that sound good? Well, I'd be very interested to hear your views, so feel free to send me a message on my website, which you can find at nickholmesauthor.com, link in the show notes. So let's get on with this episode, and I want to look at something which we've mentioned a lot about, but we haven't had an entire episode on it, and that's the story of one of the greatest empires in history, and I'm thinking of the Umayyad Caliphate, which historians date to lasting almost a century from 661 to 750. Its rise and fall dictated pretty much everything we've covered in the last few episodes of this podcast. Certainly the fortunes of Byzantium and, to a lesser extent, the kingdoms of the West. Its territories stretched from Samarkand to the Atlantic. Like the Roman Empire, it straddled three continents, Asia, Europe and Africa. But appearances can be deceptive, and to most contemporaries, the Umayyad Caliphate seemed much more fragile than it does to us today with the benefit of 1400 years of hindsight. Indeed, probably most of the populations of the conquered territories in Syria, Iraq and Egypt thought it wouldn't last. And this was because early Islam was very different from what it is today. It originally comprised Muhammad's followers who called themselves believers. The term Muslim, which means one who submits to God, is first found in the Quran, which was written several decades after Muhammad's death. And the other key point was that in the early 7th century, there were remarkably few believers. This was because there were no mass conversions to Islam of the local populations in Syria, Egypt and Iraq. Instead, for the next century and beyond, the vast majority of them remained staunchly Christian or Zoroastrian. So, when we talk about Islam in the 7th century, who and what are we actually talking about? Well, outside Arabia, we're talking about the Arab armies that had conquered Syria, Iraq and Egypt. They were mainly Bedouin tribesmen, both foot soldiers and the excellent horsemen for which the Bedouin were famous. They weren't a professional fighting force, they weren't salaried, and they were organised along tribal lines. They'd united to follow first Muhammad and then his successors, but their aim was predominantly plunder rather than a war of conquest. And that was the reason most contemporaries thought they would simply return to Arabia. But they didn't. Instead, significant numbers of Bedouin tribesmen elected to stay in newly created garrison towns. These comprised two main ones in Iraq, Kufa, just south of Baghdad, and Basra at the head of the Gulf. In Egypt, a military camp was set up at Fustat, next to the giant Roman fortress of Babylon, and in Syria another military camp was established at Jabeah, close to Damascus. The Arab tribes that elected to stay in the conquered territories, and we know that some of them returned to Arabia, settled down as an army of occupation. How large were these armies? Unfortunately, our sources are silent on this, but the scholarly consensus is that by around 661, when Muawiyah became the first Umayyad Caliph, the entire Umayyad army numbered around 300,000 men. This would have been by far the largest army in Western Eurasia and probably in the world. It comprised four main troop concentrations, around 100,000 in Syria, another 100,000 in Iraq, 50,000 in Khorasan in Iran, and 50,000 in Egypt and North Africa. And in the 8th century it grew. For example, the substantial Berber army which invaded Spain in 711 was additional to these numbers, taking them perhaps to a total of 350,000 or more if we assume some 50,000 Berbers joined the Arabs. What was this army like? Although Bedouin horsemen had been an important part of the early Arab armies, our source material is insistent that the Umayyad Caliphate relied on large numbers of infantry. Arab sources describe foot soldiers trained to fight in long lines, holding spears in front of their shields. Several Arab sources testify to the effectiveness of their spear walls against enemy cavalry. They sound a little like the ancient Greek phalanxes and hoplites. Horsemen and foot archers are described as supporting these infantry formations. The early armies weren't entirely Arab. For example, in the early years of the conquest, several units of Sasanian Persian heavy cavalry deserted and joined the Arabs for money. Turning these Bedouin tribal gatherings into professional salaried armies was what allowed Islam to become a global empire. And the key to that was money. And the key to money was taxation. The reason why the Arabs could maintain enormous armies was because they maintained the efficient Roman and Persian tax systems. This was the single most important reason in explaining the success of the Arab expansion out of Arabia, in my opinion. In addition, the Arabs didn't destroy the urban infrastructure of the ancient world, as occurred in Western Europe. Only one major Roman city was destroyed, Carthage in North Africa, which was captured in 697 and then flattened in 698. Otherwise, the great Roman and Persian cities were left unharmed. In the East, the world of late antiquity didn't die. It just continued under new rulers. It's worth pausing here and looking in a bit more detail at the Arab tax system. As early as the reign of Umar I, from 634 to 644, who was the second Rashidun Caliph, i.e. the second Caliph after Muhammad's death, the Arab sources, which as I've mentioned were written much later but which are probably reliable in this respect, describe the inauguration of a system in which the revenues from the conquered lands, i.e. the Roman taxes, were used to provide salaries to the conquerors and their descendants. The key institution for this is described as the divan, an Arabic term literally meaning a list. So when the Bedouin tribes garrisoned the conquered territories, lists of individuals were drawn up who were paid from the taxes still collected by the previously Roman administrators. And if we look at the monetary and fiscal situation in the Umayyad Caliphate in a little more detail, we know that in Iraq, the Arab soldiers were paid in Persian silver coins, referred to as dirhams in Arabic, since the Persians had no significant gold coinage, whereas in Syria and Egypt they were paid with the Roman gold coin called the solidus or numisma, which most historians describe as the dollar of the Middle Ages, since it was maintained by the Byzantines at a constant gold weight. In Arabic, the Roman gold coins were confusingly called dinars in reference to the Roman denarius, which was in fact a silver coin. It's significant that the Arabs didn't mint their own coins until the reign of Abdul Malik, which we'll come to shortly. With the benefit of large tax revenues, the Arabs could not only pay the Bedouin who made up the original armies of conquest, but they could also recruit non-Arabs who converted to Islam because they wanted to be paid. So, in the 7th century, Syrians flooded into the Arab army based in Syria, which henceforth became the Umayyads' most important military unit, and the one that fought the Byzantines. In Iraq, it was the Persians who joined the Muslim army stationed in Kufa and Basra. It's worth noting that the growing animosity between the Syrians and the Persians was the key catalyst behind the internal instability of the Umayyad Caliphate, which I'll describe in more detail shortly. This was exacerbated when Arabia ceased to be the political centre of Islam and Damascus was made the capital of Islam under the Umayyads and later Baghdad under the Abbasids. The rapidly diminishing importance of Arabia is best shown in the declining percentage of Arabs in the Umayyad army, which fell to well below 50% by the year 700. This was, I suggest, rather similar to the decline in Italian legionaries in the Roman army in the 2 centuries after Julius Caesar's conquests, who were increasingly replaced by recruits in Gaul, Illyria and Syria. Turning to population numbers in the Umayyad Caliphate, it's clear that the Arab occupying forces were heavily outnumbered by the indigenous populations. One historian has estimated that the Arab conquerors probably numbered little more than some 300,000 among a population in the entire caliphate of some 25 to 30 million. This meant there was one native Arab to almost every 100 non-Arabs. Therefore, over time, the new population was absorbed into the much larger local populations. Accelerating this process, we know many local women became the wives and concubines of the Arab tribesmen. Many of the women were, of course, Christian, although marriage to a Muslim required them to convert. The birth of their children led to a considerable blurring of racial and religious boundaries. Because of this, by the mid-8th century, Islam was in danger of losing its identity and becoming absorbed into the Romano-Persian worlds it had conquered. For example, we know from the copious quantities of papyri which have survived from this time because of the arid climate, that Greek and Persian continued as the languages of administration and commerce. Scholars have examined a set of papyrus documents in a town in Egypt dating to the reign of the Caliph Marwan, which was from 685 to 705, and which were almost entirely written in Greek, not Arabic. They estimate that there were over 60 scribes writing in Greek and only one in Arabic. The Umayyad Caliphate was also in danger of dissolving in civil war. When the first Umayyad Caliph Muawiyah died in 680, Umayyad authority was challenged by the powerful army in Iraq, and a new caliphate also sprang up in Mecca. It was then that a remarkable caliph named Abdul Malik saved the Umayyads. In 691, he ended the second fitna, or the second civil war, by suppressing all opposition to the Umayyads. Syria became the undisputed centre of the caliphate, not Arabia. Muawiyah had already made Damascus the Umayyad capital in 661, as I mentioned, but to further centralise Umayyad authority, he took steps that would now transform Islam. To start with, he set up the first Arab currency. Up until 696, nearly all the coinage used by the Arabs was Byzantine or Sasanian. But in that year, Abdul Malik introduced gold Arab dinars to replace the Byzantine numisma. Initially, a few coins were minted with the famous standing caliph design, showing Abdul Malik himself, sword by his side. But these were quickly abandoned in favour of inscriptions with no images. The gold dinars minted in Damascus were inscribed with pious phrases and the date, but without the name of the ruler, making them different from Byzantine coins, which recorded the name of the emperor in whose reign they were minted. Silver dirhams were also minted and marked in the same non-figurative fashion. The next critical change was with language. Abdul Malik required all administration in every part of the empire to be conducted in Arabic. Greek and Persian officials had to hastily learn Arabic if they wanted to keep their jobs. This was hugely significant. From then onwards, there began a new age of Islamic cultural identity and the start of what historians call the Golden Age of Islam. Abdul Malik added to this sense of Islamic identity by building one of the most iconic Muslim buildings, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, completed in 692 and inscribed with verses from the Quran, which is also the earliest known record of the Quran. Abdul Malik's son Al-Walid, who reigned from 705 to 715, built the great Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, which still stands today as another symbol of Islam. The Umayyad dynasty was now at the height of its fortunes. It returned to the offensive. Indeed, for a few decades, it looked unstoppable. As we covered in episode 115, an Arab-Berber army invaded Visigothic Spain in 711 and won the Battle of Guadalete that year, overthrowing the Visigothic king Roderick and advancing rapidly north towards the Pyrenees. By 717, the entire Iberian Peninsula was in Umayyad hands, and by 719, an Arab-Berber army had even invaded Gaul and taken Narbonne. The capture of Spain was the greatest of the Umayyad triumphs, but elsewhere they were also extending the empire. The eastern Persian province of Khorasan became the springboard for expansion into Central Asia. Bukhara fell in 709, Samarkand in 712, and Fergana in 713. But then things started to go wrong. Suleiman, Al-Walid's younger brother, succeeded him in 715, and although his reign only lasted 2 years, he conceived the boldest military expedition yet undertaken by the Umayyads, the capture of Constantinople. It proved to be a disaster. We spent an entire episode on this, number 113. The expedition was vast, reputedly with a fleet of 1,800 ships and over 100,000 soldiers, the largest the Umayyads ever launched, and probably the most significant military expedition since the end of the classical Roman Empire, and perhaps not equalled until the First Crusade marched east in 1097. Its defeat was a fatal blow to the Umayyads, in my opinion. The next 30 years saw the gradual erosion of Umayyad authority both internally and externally. Externally, the Berbers erupted in rebellion in 741, seizing North Africa and Spain. An Umayyad army sent to retrieve the situation was initially defeated with heavy casualties and only just fought its way through to Spain, where it remained cut off from the rest of the Umayyad Empire, which lost control of most of modern-day Tunisia, Algeria and Morocco to the Berbers. Meanwhile, the Khazars and Turks attacked the Arabs in the Caucasus and Khorasan. The Umayyads just managed to stave off a complete collapse on their eastern front. In 737, an Arab-Iranian army defeated the Turks and stabilized the frontier in Khorasan. In the Caucasus, the situation was also retrieved when an Arab expeditionary force made it to the Khazar capital on the lower Volga. But the expansionist days of the Umayyads were over. It was internal dissatisfaction with the Caliphate that finally brought it down. The later caliphs were extremely unpopular. They weren't soldiers, and the Byzantine soldier emperors like Leo III and Constantine V put them to shame, routing the Umayyad army at Akroinon in 740 and pushing the Arabs south beyond the Taurus Mountains. When Al-Walid II became caliph in 743, he was criticized for his indulgent lifestyle. Famous for enjoying wine, women and song, frescoes from his palaces have survived to this day, depicting erotic art with naked women and men drinking wine. This shocked Muslim sentiment so profoundly he was murdered in 744 and succeeded by Yazid III, who only reigned for 3 months until Marwan II took on the reins of government. He was different, a tough soldier and the former governor of Armenia, known as Al-Himar, or the ass, in reference to his personal strength. It looked as if at last the Umayyads might have the caliph they needed. But it was not to be. The Byzantines won further victories when Constantine V recaptured Germanicea and Cyprus. A new dynasty in Iraq challenged Umayyad authority. These were the Abbasids, descendants of Al-Abbas ibn Abd al-Muttalib, who'd been one of the Prophet Muhammad's uncles. In 749, an Abbasid by the name of Abu Abbas al-Safa was proclaimed caliph in Kufa in Iraq in direct opposition to Marwan. Marwan marched to meet him in battle beside the river Jab in January 750. Our principal sources, which are biased in favour of the Abbasids, claim Marwan had most of the Syrian army with him, numbering over 100,000, to fight an Abbasid army of only 12,000. If this was correct, the Umayyads should easily have won. However, we can be sure that, as usual with sources written by the victors, the Umayyad numbers were exaggerated. The battle was probably fairly evenly matched. Unusually, we have a vivid description of it, which describes how the Abbasid army, which had only few Arabs and was famous for its heavy Persian cavalry, kept these horsemen in reserve and concentrated its infantry in a line to meet the Umayyad attack. The Abbasid foot soldiers knelt with spears pointing at the Umayyad cavalry, who were mainly Syrians with some Bedouin. One of the Abbasid soldiers recorded, quote, "The Syrians attacked us like a mountain of iron, but we knelt down and pointed our spears, and they turned away from us like a cloud." End quote. The Abbasids won a resounding victory. The Umayyad Caliph Marwan was wounded in the battle and fled to Egypt, where 6 months after his defeat in August 750 he was captured and killed. Meanwhile, the Abbasids took Damascus, the Umayyad capital, where they butchered all the men of Umayyad descent they could get their hands on. 72 of them, according to the chronicler Al-Tabari. But one escaped. Abdul Rahman fled west to the Berbers. His mother had been a Berber slave girl sent to the Umayyad court as a concubine, and he returned to her homeland. There, in 756, he founded the independent emirate of Cordoba, an Umayyad principality which existed for the next 200 years and became the main centre of Arab civilization outside the ambit of the Abbasid Empire. In conclusion, the Umayyad Caliphate marked the high point of Arab military power. In the first decades of the 8th century, it looked as if the Arabs might even conquer Europe. But ultimately, they failed. Defeated beneath the walls of Constantinople, Islam wouldn't mount another attack on the Christian capital for over 700 years. The Umayyads established one of the greatest empires in history. But their legacy was soon obscured by the rise of the Abbasids, who inaugurated what most historians call the Golden Age of Islam. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. In the next episode, in 2 weeks' time, on the 17th of January, we'll move on to the Abbasid Caliphate. And if you like the podcast, why not leave a review, tell a friend, or best of all, sign up to my newsletter where you can get a free ebook. Just visit my website, nickholmesauthor.com, link in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.